On June 17, 1940, somewhere between 4,000 and 9,000 people were packed onto a single British ship anchored off the coast of France. That afternoon, German bombers found them. Within 20 minutes, the ship was gone, dragging thousands of men, women, and children to the bottom of the Loire estuary. The death toll was staggering. By the most conservative estimates, at least 4,000 people died. Some historians put the number closer to 7,000. That is more than the Titanic and the Lusitania combined. And yet there is a very good chance you have never heard of this ship, because on the same day it sank, Winston Churchill sat in his cabinet room in London and made a decision. He picked up the phone and killed the story. This is the Lancastria. And for over 80 years, almost nobody talked about what happened to her. To understand how thousands of people ended up on a doomed ship off the coast of France, you need to go back 20 years to a shipyard on the River Clyde in Scotland. In 1920, the William Beardmore Company in Dalmuir launched a brand new ocean liner for the Anchor Line, a subsidiary of Cunard. She was over 570 feet long, weighed more than 16,000 gross tons, and had 7 decks. They named her the Tyrrhenia, after a region in central Italy. It sounded elegant on paper. In practice, passengers could not pronounce it. The crew started calling her Old Soup Turenne, which tells you everything. By 1924, Cunard gave up and renamed her the Lancastria, after the county of Lancashire. She got a full refit at the same time, emerging as a sleek 2-class passenger vessel ready for the Atlantic. For the next 15 years, the Lancastria lived a life most ships only dream about. She crossed between Liverpool and New York on scheduled routes through the 1920s, carrying passengers in 2 classes across the North Atlantic. The crossing took about a week, and the Lancastria was not the fastest or the most famous ship on the route, but she was steady, reliable, and well-liked. When the Great Depression gutted transatlantic passenger demand in the early 30s, Cunard moved her into full-time cruising. She sailed the Mediterranean, Northern Europe, and the Caribbean. In 1932, she rescued the entire crew of a Belgian cargo ship called the Scheldestad, which had been abandoned in a sinking condition in the Bay of Biscay. In 1934, the Catholic Boy Scouts of Ireland chartered her for a pilgrimage to Rome. 2 years later, she carried a passenger list that included Admiral of the Fleet Roger Keyes and Field Marshal William Birdwood on a specially commissioned cruise visiting war memorials at Malta, Gallipoli, and Istanbul. She was, by every measure, a grand old lady of the sea. Her final peacetime voyage ended in September 1939, docked in New York Harbor with the Bahamas still fading behind her, and the world at war. The glamour disappeared fast. Workers in New York blacked out her portholes, slapped drab grey military paint over her Cunard livery, and bolted guns near what used to be the swimming pool. She was requisitioned as His Majesty's Troopship Lancastria and sent straight to work. Her first wartime assignment took her to Norway, where she evacuated 2,600 troops and barely dodged German bombers in the process. The crew came back to Glasgow and asked that the surplus fuel oil in her tanks be pumped out because they had seen what bombs do to ships carrying too much fuel. There was not enough time. The Lancastria was ordered south to Liverpool for a quick refit and then sent back out again because Dunkirk was only half the story. Everyone knows about the miracle at Dunkirk. Between May 27th and June 4th, 1940, over 338,000 Allied soldiers were pulled off the beaches in one of the most celebrated rescues in military history. Churchill called it a miracle of deliverance. But what almost nobody remembers is that when the last boats left Dunkirk, roughly 140,000 British troops were still scattered across western and southern France. They were spread through supply depots, communications posts, airfields, and rear echelon camps, and the German army was closing in from every direction. These soldiers needed to get out too. The evacuation that came next was called Operation Ariel. It ran from June 15th to the 25th, 1940, and it was coordinated by Admiral James out of Portsmouth, using over 130 British and Allied liners, merchant ships, motor vessels, and tugs. They were dispatched from ports all along the southern and western coasts of England. The operation pulled more than 210,000 servicemen and several thousand civilians from ports along the French Atlantic coast and the Channel Islands, along with over 2,000 military vehicles, 310 guns, and 1,800 tons of supplies and stores. By the numbers, it was even larger than Dunkirk. But you have probably never heard of Operation Ariel either, because what happened during it was so catastrophic that the British government decided the public simply could not know. At Saint-Nazaire alone, an estimated 40,000 to 60,000 men, women, and children were waiting to be rescued. The harbour was 430 miles to the southwest, on the coast of Brittany, and it was under constant air attack. The situation there was desperate. Other transport ships had already been hit. The 20,000-ton liner Oronsay had her bridge devastated by bombs. The Franconia was damaged badly enough that she had to limp back to England for repairs. And still, the evacuees kept arriving at the docks, soldiers and refugees pouring in from every direction, hoping for a ship that could carry them to safety. The Lancastria left Liverpool on June 14th under the command of Captain Rudolph Sharp. She arrived at the mouth of the Loire estuary 2 days later and anchored at a spot called the Charpentier Roads, about 5 nautical miles southwest of the port of Saint-Nazaire. Around 30 other merchant vessels of every shape and size were already anchored there. The port itself was a bottleneck. A narrow tidal channel made it impossible for large ships to dock directly, so destroyers, fishing boats, and smaller craft had to ferry evacuees out to the waiting transports through open water while the Luftwaffe circled overhead. The ferrying trips took 3 to 4 hours each way, and the whole time, German planes were bombing and strafing the little boats. Early on the morning of June 17th, 3 Royal Navy Reserve officers came aboard the Lancastria and asked Captain Sharp how many people his ship could carry. Sharp said he could manage 3,000 if he really pushed it. The ship's official passenger capacity was 1,300. With crew, the total was 2,200. Sharp was already talking about exceeding every safety margin he had. But the Navy did not care about safety margins. Not that day. The order came down in language that left no room for interpretation. Captain Sharp was instructed to load as many men as possible, without regard to the limits set down under international law. Think about what that sentence means. It means the Royal Navy told Sharp to cram human beings onto his ship until there was physically no space left, knowing full well that the Lancastria carried life-saving equipment for about 2,500 people. And so they loaded. All morning and into the afternoon, boats ferried passengers out from Saint-Nazaire while bombs fell around them. The ferrying trips through the tidal channel took 3 to 4 hours each way, and the small boats were being bombed and machine-gunned by Luftwaffe Junkers the entire time. British soldiers from the Pioneer Corps and the Royal Army Service Corps climbed aboard the Lancastria, looking shell-shocked and exhausted. 800 Royal Air Force personnel were packed into the No. 2 hold below decks. Civilian refugees from Belgium and France scrambled up the gangways, some of them embassy staff, some of them employees of the Ferry Aviation Company who had been working in Belgian factories when the German army rolled in. Women and children mixed in with soldiers who had been retreating on foot for weeks. One of the French troops guarding the Saint-Nazaire docks spat at the feet of a British officer as he wished them goodbye. Nobody kept an accurate count of who boarded the Lancastria. Nobody could. The ship's manifest for that day does not exist in any meaningful way, which is why estimates of how many people were actually on board range from 4,000 at the low end to 9,000 at the high end. The honest answer is that nobody will ever know for certain. By the middle of the afternoon, the ship was grotesquely overloaded. Captain Sharp wanted to leave, but there was a problem. The nearby Oronsay, a 20,000-ton Orient liner, had just been hit on the bridge by a German bomb at around 1:50 in the afternoon. The Lancastria was technically free to depart, and the captain of the British destroyer Havelock told Sharp to go. But Sharp refused to sail without a proper destroyer escort because he was worried about U-boats lurking in the estuary. So the Lancastria sat there, anchored, stationary, packed to the rails with thousands of people, waiting. The air raid sirens from Saint-Nazaire harbor screamed again just before 4 in the afternoon. A formation of Junkers 88 bombers from the second group of Kampfgeschwader 30, a specialized anti-shipping squadron, came screaming in from the sky. These pilots were trained specifically to sink ships. They looked down and saw an enormous vessel sitting motionless in the water with no air cover and no escort. A few Bren gunners on the Lancastria's deck opened fire, trying to drive the planes off. Their light machine guns were useless against fast-moving bombers. 4 bombs fell. 2 hit the water nearby, sending columns of spray across the deck. The other 2 hit the Lancastria directly. One smashed through the dining salon and exploded on a lower deck, ripping gaping holes in the ship's side and killing hundreds of people instantly. The other, according to multiple survivors, went straight down the ship's single funnel and detonated inside the engine room. The effect was catastrophic. An engineering officer named Frank Brogden, who was in the engine room at the time, felt the explosion tear through everything around him. The ship's power died. The lights went out. Somewhere on deck, survivors later described the air raid siren as a chilling scream howling from the sky. A 15-year-old boy who helped with the rescue operations afterward described the scene he witnessed as hell, abominable, the height of horror, and the Lancastria began to die. She listed first to starboard, then rolled hard to port. The entire sequence from the first bomb strike to the ship disappearing beneath the surface took roughly 20 minutes. But those 20 minutes contained a kind of suffering that most people alive today cannot imagine. The ship had 16 lifeboats. Some were destroyed by the bombing. Others could not be launched because the ship was listing too severely and the davits would not swing out properly. Of the 2,500 life jackets on board, there were nowhere near enough for the thousands packed onto every surface. People jumped from the decks into the water 30 feet below, and some of them broke their necks on their own life jackets when they hit the surface. Hundreds of others were trapped below decks in the holds and the lower compartments. The 800 RAF men in hold number 2 never had a chance. The water came in too fast. And then the oil came. Over 1,400 tons of fuel oil from the Lancastria's ruptured tanks poured into the sea around the sinking ship. It spread across the surface of the water in a thick, black, choking blanket. Survivors who jumped in found themselves swallowing oil, blinded by it, unable to grip anything because their hands were coated in it. The oil filled their lungs. Rescue boats that tried to pull people from the water could not get a grip on oil-slicked arms and legs. People slipped out of the hands of their rescuers and sank. And the Germans were not finished. The Junkers came back around and began strafing the water. Pilots flew low over the wreckage and fired machine guns into the mass of people struggling in the oil. Survivors described the bullets hitting the water around them while they tried to swim. Then, according to multiple eyewitness accounts, the German aircraft dropped incendiary devices into the floating oil, trying to set the sea itself on fire. One survivor, named Henry Harding, would later say that if there was a hell on earth, he saw it that day. But in the middle of that hell, something happened that is hard to hear without feeling something crack inside your chest. As the Lancastria rolled over and her hull came up out of the water, hundreds of soldiers who had managed to climb onto the exposed steel plates stood there, balanced on the belly of a dying ship, with German bombers still circling overhead. And they started singing. They sang, "Roll Out the Barrel." They sang, "There Will Always Be an England." Standing on the hull of a ship that was about to take them to the bottom, with fire on the water and planes trying to kill them, they sang. Some survivors have disputed whether this actually happened. Others swear they heard it with their own ears while treading water nearby. The image has become part of the Lancastria story either way, because it captures something about what happened that day that raw numbers cannot. These were ordinary men, not professional soldiers for the most part, but clerks and drivers and supply workers and aircraft mechanics who had been told to get on a ship and go home. And in the last minutes before that ship took them under, some of them chose to sing. When the ship finally went under, the smaller vessels in the area rushed in to pull survivors from the oil-covered water. The The trawler Cambridgeshire alone rescued 900 people. Other fishing boats, destroyers, and civilian craft joined in, all of them working under continuous air attack from the Luftwaffe. Survivors, who had enough strength left in their bodies, dived back into the oil-black water to pull out wounded soldiers who could not swim. There were countless acts of bravery that day, most of which were never formally recognized by any government or military citation. Some men spent 4 hours or more in the water before they were finally picked up. By the end of the day, roughly 2,477 survivors had been pulled from the sea. The mathematics of that number are brutal. If the lowest estimate of those on board, around 4,000, is correct, then at least 1,500 people died. But if the higher estimates are closer to the truth, and some historians believe 7,000 or more were aboard, then the death toll could reach 5,000 or beyond. The most commonly cited figure is around 4,000 dead. Even at the low end, more people died on the Lancastria than on the Titanic and the Lusitania put together. Bodies washed up on the beaches of the Loire estuary for weeks. A French resident of the nearby island of Noirmoutier, a boy named Michel Adrien, who was 6 years old at the time, later described the bodies spilling out from the sea, some of them still warm. Local people buried them where they found them. Many were never identified. Among the survivors were people whose stories stayed buried for decades. Jacqueline Tanner was 2 years old when the bombs hit. She was on the ship with her parents, who had been living in Belgium and were fleeing the German invasion. As the Lancastria began to capsize, her mother pushed through the panicking crowd, screaming, "Baby here, baby here," and the crowd parted to let them through to the deck. They were loaded into a lifeboat, but the lifeboat sank almost immediately. The family ended up in the water, clinging to floating wreckage while German planes fired into the oil around them, until they were picked up by a rescue vessel called the Highlander. The Highlander's deck was already covered with bodies. Jack Morgan was a young soldier who survived the sinking and lived to be over 100 years old. For most of his life, he never spoke about what happened. He could not, because of what happened next. When news of the Lancastria reached London that same afternoon, it landed on the desk of Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Britain was already reeling. France was falling. Dunkirk was barely 2 weeks old. The country was bracing for a German invasion that most people expected within months. And now this. The worst single loss of life in British military history, on a ship most people did not even know had been sent to France. Churchill's response was immediate. He issued what is called a D notice, a formal request to all British media outlets to suppress the story. His reasoning, as he later wrote in his memoirs, was blunt. He said that the newspapers had quite enough disaster for today at least, and with that, the Lancastria was erased. No British newspaper printed a word about it. Survivors who arrived back in England were ordered not to discuss what had happened. The threat was court-martial. These were men who had watched their friends drown in burning oil, who had swallowed fuel and seawater, who had seen German fighter planes strafe people in the water around them. They were told to go home and say nothing. Some of them kept that silence for the rest of their lives. One Scottish survivor, named Walter, never told his family what had happened. His son later said that the Lancastria only ever came up after a couple of pints at the pub, and even then, only in fragments. Walter never saw his friend Charlie again after that day, and he assumed until his death in 1989 that Charlie had been killed in the sinking. Charlie had actually survived too. They never found each other. Many families of the dead received only a standard notification that their relative had died while serving with the British Expeditionary Force. No details, no explanation, no mention of a ship. The silence held for nearly 6 weeks. Then the New York Sun broke the story in late July 1940, printing dramatic photographs of the disaster that had somehow made it out of France. British and Scottish newspapers followed cautiously. The late edition of The Scotsman on July 25th ran a 6-paragraph story buried in the middle of page 5, citing the American reporting and listing just 500 feared dead. The following day, also on page 5, a longer article appeared, noting that nearly 2,500 were known to have been saved from a total of 5,300 aboard. Both figures were wrong, but by then the Battle of Britain was raging in the skies over southern England, and the country had bigger things to worry about. The Lancastria slipped out of the headlines almost as quickly as it had appeared. Churchill later admitted in his memoirs that he had intended to lift the D notice after a few days, once the initial shock had passed. But, he wrote, "Events crowded upon us so black and so quickly that he simply forgot. He forgot to tell the British public that thousands of their sons and brothers and fathers had died on a single afternoon in the mouth of the Loire." The D notice, according to some accounts, was not formally set to expire until 2040, a full century after the disaster. And the forgetting continued. For decades, the Lancastria existed in a strange twilight between history and silence. The families of the dead often knew nothing beyond that single official letter. The survivors carried the memory alone, bound by an order that most of them honored for the rest of their lives. There was no national memorial service. There was no public reckoning. The wreck site off Saint-Nazaire was not designated a protected war grave by the British government, despite repeated requests from survivors, families, and prominent public figures, including a former head of the British Army. The French government eventually placed an exclusion zone around the wreck in 2006. The Scottish government issued a commemorative medal in 2008 because roughly 400 Scots had died in the sinking, and Scotland wanted to acknowledge what London would not. But the British government continued to resist formal recognition. In 2007, a request for classified Ministry of Defence documents related to the sinking was rejected. A further request from the Lancastria Association of Scotland in 2009 was also turned down. The relatives were told that documentary evidence remained unavailable and might not be released until 2040, which was of no comfort because by then most of them would be dead too. Think about what that means for a moment. Thousands of families spent decades never knowing how their loved ones actually died. They did not know about the oil or the fire or the machine guns. They did not know that their fathers sang while a ship sank underneath them. They did not know that their government had decided, on the worst day of those families' lives, that the truth was too dangerous to share. The Lancastria took more British lives in a single afternoon than any other event in the entire Second World War. She sits on the seabed off Saint-Nazaire to this day, in about 20 meters of water, still holding the remains of people whose names were never recorded on any manifest. A memorial stands on the seafront at Saint-Nazaire, a large piece of granite engraved in gold with a simple inscription. It says, "We have not forgotten." There is a stained glass window at St. Catherine Cree Church in London. There is a statue in the grounds of the Golden Jubilee Hospital in Clydebank, on the site of the shipyard where the Lancastria was built. But there is no war grave, and there is no full accounting of the dead. It took nearly 50 years for the first official memorial to be erected, a piece of granite on the Saint-Nazaire seafront overlooking the spot where the ship went down. And until very recently, if you asked the average person in Britain to name the country's worst maritime disaster, they would have said the Titanic without hesitating. They would have been wrong by thousands. The Lancastria was not lost because of mechanical failure or navigational error or bad luck. She was lost because she was ordered to carry more people than any ship could safely hold, in a war zone, without proper escort or air cover, while enemy bombers flew in clear skies above her. Her crew had asked for the excess fuel to be pumped out of her tanks after the Norway mission. There was not enough time. Her captain had asked for a destroyer escort before sailing. It never arrived. Every safeguard that might have reduced the death toll was either denied or ignored in the chaos of a collapsing front. And she was forgotten because a prime minister decided, in a moment of crisis, that the truth was a luxury Britain could not afford. 86 years later, the families of the dead are still waiting for someone in power to say the whole thing out loud. If this story stayed with you, take a second to subscribe and hit the like button so more people can find it. And if you have a connection to the Lancastria, whether it is a family member, a story you were told, or something you found in old papers, drop it in the comments because these stories deserve to be heard.